Great, thank you, Linda. Like Linda mentioned, we're, I guess, doing some webinars for some extension purposes to try to get get in touch with as many people as we can, and these are going to be recorded. So for the first one, we were thinking that we should start looking at planning for the 2013 forage year, probably because we're looking at a shortage of feed right now. A lot of producers are looking to buy feed and are in a tight feed situation. They're doing a lot of different things for feeding. So we were thinking, well, and that's the case, guys are probably going to want to get as much as they can out of their next year's forage crop. So with that in mind, we thought we'd get Jane to come on, and Jane would be able to go over some of the practices for assessing our forages and then what we can do to get the best yield we can for 2013. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, and I'm just going to key up her presentation here. And Jane will take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, Lon was saying, we've had a pretty bad couple of forage years, and there's a lot of different situations out there. So I wanted to go over some ideas that I had. We've been having a lot of talks about whether or not we should be looking at rejuvenating stands. As you see in the picture, a lot of the area last year and the year before was flooded, and those guys had to wait all through this last year for that to dry up. In other areas of the province, we actually, after about the end of June, we had drought, and so we had very poor forage yields. So I want to go over some ideas of how we can get some better production. One of the things about reseeding a forage stand is, you're at least probably a year out before that forage stand becomes productive. So I want to talk about some things with perennial forages that you can do to maybe try to take up that slack a little bit. So I want to talk about fertilizing existing stands to make up either for your lost stands that are still not reseeded and producing, or for the feed shortages you have due to drought or whatever. And we have done quite a bit of work over the years with fertilizing forages, and for the most part, beef producers do not fertilize forages. But over and over again, we seem to see that fertilizing does pay, and I'm going to go over a number of different slides looking at it in a number of different ways as to whether or not it would pay for you to fertilize your forages. The pictures you see in the bottom of this picture are a project that we did back in about 2002. It was on overgrazed pasture, and the first slide with 2,400 pounds is a double from what it was producing by just incorporating rotational grazing. And then the second slide of 4,000 pounds per acre was with 50 pounds of nitrogen. So there was quite a bit of benefit there. So the first thing we have to look at, particularly if you're doing hay crops, you're taking off a lot of nutrients. We're going to look at the green and the brown bars here, which represent the grass and the alfalfa, and you can see they've put in a 3 ton per acre or 5 ton per acre estimate, but you can see that annual crops, this here does not take off much potash. Your grass takes up some, your alfalfa takes up a huge amount. Phosphorus, it's again a lot of nutrients, and sulfur is very important to the forages, particularly to alfalfa. And when you're doing a hay crop, you are not recycling any of those nutrients. Those nutrients go off with the bale, and if you're not going to fertilize your forage stands, you are basically mining the soils, and nutrients become the limiting factor, not moisture in production. In a grazing system, probably about, depending on the nutrients, 70 to 80% of the nutrients are recycled on the field through the manure. But in haying systems, you're simply taking the nutrients off, so eventually you run out of nutrients. This was a study done at Crossfield, Alberta. That's about an hour north of Calgary, so it's a little bit drier probably than we are out here. But they looked at putting on different levels of nitrogen and the response to moisture. And you can see that both of them start off very poor without any fertility at all. That would be just normal fertility, probably a stand that's quite low. And this is a grass foraged yield table. So You can see with the first 50 pounds you get quite a jump, and with more moisture, of course, the nutrients don't become the limiting factor than the water does here. And for the next 100 pounds, if you're dry, you don't get as much response. If it still stays moist, what that's telling you is that moisture is not limiting, and so it can use that next 50 pounds of nitrogen. What I think we find in most of the work we've done is 50 pounds of nitrogen on grass is about where you want to stop, because we never know when we're going to be running into one of these drought situations. So I did a little table here. Under droughty conditions, that was by that table, that graph prior, without any fertilizer at all, they were getting about 1,100 pounds. And with 50 pounds of nitrogen, they got another 2,400 pounds. They more than doubled their production. And then for the next 100, you can see it's diminishing returns. They only got another 300 pounds of added value or forage. So even this is rated at the nitrogen at about what it was when I did this table up a couple weeks ago, was 62 cents a pound. And at 50 pounds, that's $31 an acre. This added forage that they took off was $84 in the pocket of the producer when you valued that hay at 3.5 cents a pound. And you're going to see that's pretty cheap, because when we look at the cost of productions of putting up hay and doing hay, it's actually higher than that. You can see for that next 11 or next 300 pounds you get for that extra 50 pounds, the value goes, and so you're actually in the droughty conditions, you're losing money on that extra 50 pounds. When you have adequate moisture, certainly your biggest bang is right here for your first 50 pounds. Again, you started off with only about 1,320 pounds of production. That's because it had more moisture, so it could produce more. But you add 50 pounds of nitrogen, and again, you've more than doubled your production. And if water doesn't become limiting, you get another big jump. And so the margin on that is $70 or $46. So in each case, it pays. The one case it doesn't pay is if you head into drought, into the summer, and water becomes your limiting factor, and then you go into the negative on that extra 50 pounds. So this was a project that we did in 2002, those pictures that were in the first slide that I showed you. And there was about 5 sites across the province that were done. And in general, I think this is all of these sites added together. They were producing under 1,000 pounds of forage under a continuous overstock grazing situation. And just by correcting the stocking rate and going to a rotational grazing system, which means allowing the forages to rest, they more than doubled their production on that site. And when you did the rotational grazing plus added 50 pounds, you more than quadrupled your production. But look over here when we did 100 pounds of nitrogen, or even a split application of 50 pounds the first go-round and 50 pounds in the second. Again, it's diminishing returns. You really weren't getting much benefit for that. So again, that leads us to believe that probably for most guys, 100 pounds of nitrogen is not worth it. And even when we did the split application, what that's really telling us is in our climate, for the most part in midsummer, after you've taken your hay cut, it's too dry for the forages to make use of that nitrogen that you're adding on. So water becomes your limiting factor, even if you've added on the nutrients. So what actually happens often is, for a lot of guys, they have a mix stand, and so it's kind of the question, what do you put on in a mix stand? Because you don't really want to throw on a lot of nitrogen in a stand that has both grass and legumes. The grass can outcompete the legume, and what you want is a high legume component because it's fixing nitrogen for you. So when you're up here, you basically, when you have a very high component, you probably don't want to add nitrogen to your fertilizer. You will get a little bit in your fertilizer mixes, and I wouldn't add any more. So basically they recommend you put P and K on to soil test. In that I would also include sulfur. And then if you're getting down here where you don't have very much legume left in your stand, you use this rate right here. So you use the nitrogen rate for the pure grass. So if they said to put on 60 pounds of nitrogen, you would take that minus the percent legume times the nitrogen rate, and that would give you how much nitrogen you should put on, and then the P and K to the soil test. This was some work done at Arborg, and when they did it, they were assuming that the P rate was 52 cents a pound. Currently it's at 55, but they were also only valuing the hay at 1.5 cents a pound, where this year I valued it at 3.5 cents a pound. But the long and the short of it is every year this is the cost of the pea, and this is those 2 years worth of fertility added to that stand, and it paid every single year. You can see here in the 1 year it was drier, so they figured that about 80 pounds of P205 was about the best that you could probably do in their area. And I think with the hay being valued more, you can definitely afford this. So just recently, this last fall, new cost production sheets were done, and I will show you where the link on the Manitoba website is for those. These cost production sheets are very helpful. If you go in on those sheets, they have both a PDF that you can print off, and they have an Excel file that you can work on. And on that Excel file, you can have it has an input tab, and you can go in and change any of these numbers that you want to change, because your land costs or equipment costs or anything might be different. And so then you can come out with what your costs are, and it will take it from that input sheet and automatically put it into the summary sheet for you. But this is done, hasn't been done for a number of years, and this is quite up to date. And so when we get down, this is our operating costs, and you may agree or disagree with them, but they do try to do a good job of taking an average or finding out what true costs are for producers. This is their fixed costs, and basically if you look at what it cost to establish, it was $229. This is an alfalfa stand, so they took that $229 over 5 years, which they're sort of assuming is the life of that stand. You may get more years out of that, but that comes out to almost $46 per acre per year. And so your annual costs per acre turn out to be $254 per acre. And if you take that by dollars per ton, it comes out to $106 per ton. I often break that down into pounds. Some guys will use dollars per ton. I don't like using how much it costs per bale, because bale weights vary significantly. So if you always work it down to a common denominator, it gives you a pretty good idea where you're at. So you can see if you are either buying hay at 3.5 cents a pound or you're selling hay at 3.5 cents a pound, you're probably losing money unless you can justify that the fixed and operating costs in your farm are much lower. So what I did was I went in and I took out the cost of the fertilizer. I've left in the fertilizer that they put on the first year, and then I took it out for the next year's, and also the application cost for that fertilizer. So you can see that your cost per acre does come down, but what happens when you don't fertilize, as per those other graphs that I've shown you, you don't get the yield. And so I actually decreased the yield. You'll see on the input pages that you can show what you normally get for yield. And so I decreased it down to what I think is quite common for the area. And so you end up, your cost per ton goes up. And so now that hay, instead of being 4.8 cents a pound, is now 7.3 cents a pound. So that hay's become very expensive for you because you didn't put on fertilizer. So I guess it's up to you to make up your mind, but to me that's getting to be very expensive hay, particularly for a beef herd. I also they have the alfalfa grass cost production sheet, and I didn't do the whole thing. For some reason it comes out quite a bit more expensive. It ended up being 6.2 cents a pound, and when I took out the fertilizer, it went up a little bit, but not much more. And I haven't looked through all of the things, but there are some differences in there in yield with the grass in it, and seed costs and herbicide costs and that sort of thing. So you can go on to the MAFRI website, and on the front of the page you will find a heading called Production and Economics. And then you have to go down to the left-hand side and go down to crops. And when you get into crops, there will be a box there that says Production and Economics, and you go into that. And then you go back to the left-hand side and you go into Forages. And then you will be on the Forages page, and you will pick Marketing and Economics. And you just scroll down and you'll come up with the cost production sheets for alfalfa and alfalfa grass. And they are both in PDF and Excel files. If you open the Excel files, you can put in your own cost of production. One of the other things we want to look at is when not it's time to rejuvenate your stand. And this is actually a score sheet that comes out of Wisconsin, which is very concerned about alfalfa down in that area because they're a high dairy area. But it does help show how you can maybe rate your stand and start giving it a point system so you know whether or not your stand is at high risk of not making it through the winter or whatever. So they use greater than 3 years, you lose 4 points. If it's a young stand, it's more likely to overwinter better. How winter hardy is it? So this actually sounds backwards to me, lower than recommended for region. So that would be like you putting in a rangelander, which is a winter hardiness or a fall dormancy of like 1, as opposed to using one that's a 5. So that gets less points. You lose more points for trying to use a variety that isn't quite as hardy for your area. We don't have as much for disease in our area, but we are starting to get more diseases as we're getting warmer, less cold winters and warmer summers. Disease seems to be becoming more prevalent. And so choosing a variety, knowing what the resistances are and what diseases are in your area. One of the things that to bring up is a lot of guys will use common seed. And these two questions right here, you can't really answer them very adequately because common seed cannot be sold with the variety name. So you actually have no idea how winter hardy it is or if it has any disease package with it. So I don't think cheap seed is always the best way to go. It asks about your soil pH, and in Manitoba we're pretty blessed in most areas that our pH is neutral or higher, which is really good for alfalfa. Alfalfa does not like acidic soils, and so we're a very good alfalfa growing area, so we're kind of blessed in that way. It asks about the K level, and you can see if you have more K, the better that plant will overwinter. It talks about internal drainage in your soils. Of course, alfalfa is very sensitive to high water table or too much water on the land. And also how wet it was. If it was really wet going in, that's probably going to be detrimental to your alfalfa, but of course you don't want it bone dry either. So here's the point about potassium. Potassium is really important for alfalfa survival. And this was a study done in Manitoba, and you can see that it appears that the soil K was quite high. They looked at the percent alfalfa, and this was taken as the number of plants in May as a percent of those the previous September. So what they did is they went out in September and they said, oh, well, in this square foot I have 4 plants, and then the next spring they go out and they count how many survived the winter. And you can see that every year it dropped off. And interestingly enough, it takes about 4, 5, or 6 years for you to recuperate the cost of seeding that forage stand. So just about the time you've recuperated the cost of seeding that forage stand, your alfalfa has diminished greatly. They put on 100 pounds of potassium every year, and you can see that the alfalfa stayed in the stand quite good. But you do have to remember this is a percent of the amount that was there the year before. So it could be dropping a little bit, but it does not drop anywhere near what it does without potassium. So potassium really helps with winter survival. And with the cost of production sheets, you can see how expensive it is to establish a forage stand. So maintaining it is really important to get that longevity out of it. Some more questions on this have to do with your cutting interval. Not very many people go less than 30 days here. I would think most are greater than 35 days. And their cutting dates are a little bit different. Here we'd probably be saying August 15th to about October 15th. So if you're cutting it more like in June, July, or the beginning of August, you would rate lower. You'd get a lower score here. And theirs is a little bit, they're a warmer climate, so they can delay that a little bit. But alfalfa should not be cut that last 5 to 6 weeks before the first killing frost. We don't know when that first killing frost is going to be, so generally speaking, we say don't cut it after August 15th, and if you haven't, then you kind of need to wait till you do get a killing frost or a killing frost is imminent. Do you leave a good stubble height? And here you can see that if you leave 6 inches or more, then you're going to do better. So in the end, you tally up your score from this sheet, and it gives you a winter injury risk. And if you're in that 3 to 7, then you're low to below average, and if you're in that greater than 17, then you're very high and in likelihood of losing a lot of plants in that stand on being on its way out. So for alfalfa stand assessment, basically it's, yield is a function of stem density, and you calculate that by the number of crowns times the number of stems per crown. And as the stand ages, the number of crowns decreases. So even if you put on, you can put on 8 pounds when you're seeding, and you'll probably have, 60 seedlings per square foot, and the next year it will drop down, and it will drop down, and it will drop down, and it'll get to a kind of a maintenance stage. But what happens is the number of stems per crown increases. And so what you're kind of looking for is probably 30 to 40 stems per square foot. And it doesn't matter if it comes from 40 plants or it comes from one plant with 40 stems. That's how you get the highest yield. So it's about stem density, so what you're looking for. So if you've only got, say, five stems per square foot, well, you're not going to get the yield. The plant can't make it up. It needs those stems there. So in our stands, most of them decline due to root rot, and sometimes they're taken out because of pocket gophers as well. Grass stands are a little bit harder to assess. One of the questions you need to ask yourself is, are the productive species that you seeded there still in the stand? And so if you seeded something like meadow brome and alfalfa, and you now have a stand of that fine, what's called June grass or Kentucky bluegrass in the stand, and your alfalfa is pretty gone, then those aren't as productive a species as what was in your stand originally. So then you can look at that, and you can also look at whether or not the stand has thinned out, so whether or not you don't have a good ground cover, and you will know that it's time either to fertilize or do something to that stand. It depends on whether or not it's rhizomatous species or non-rhizomatous species. This is a picture of alfalfa roots. So when you're trying to assess that stand as well, one of the things you should do is go out and walk a transect in your alfalfa stand and dig up maybe, say, 10 plants at varying distances across the field. And the one on the far left here is a healthy root, and you can see it's nice and creamy white. And then as we go this way, we get into varying degrees of what's called crown rot. And it basically starts up in the crown of the plant, and the disease gets in through a fracture or something like that in the crown of that plant, and it goes down through the root and can be quite devastating. See, this one has hardly any live root left. This is all, this brown is dead. So that's usually what. So if you're going across and you dig up 10 plants and they all have crown rot in them, you know that stand's not going to produce very well. It probably will continue to produce, but it won't produce very well. And it's because the crown becomes asymmetrical. With an alfalfa plant, you want buds all the way around the crown, and you'll find with this type of disease that the one side will die, and you'll only have a few crowns coming off, or a few buds coming off the one side. So it might be indicating that it's time to take it out. If you're looking at reseeding, I don't have too many slides on the reseeding aspect. We've been doing a lot of talks about rejuvenating stems, but do make sure that you get an adapted forage. And we do have this sheet both online on the Manitoba Forage Council, or Manitoba Agriculture Food and Rural Initiative's website, as well as you can pick them up in the offices. And what they do is not just the legumes, they do tame grasses and some of our native grasses. They give you their longevity, winter hardiness, how drought tolerant, flood tolerant, salinity tolerant, alkalinity tolerance, and acidity tolerance they are. And so there's no point in putting in, say, a species where you know you've got flooding or you have ponding of water when the plant is low in it. You want to pick something that's going to be high. Vice versa, something like bird's foot trefoil, if you're high and dry, it's not it's a species that doesn't do very well in that because it actually needs quite a bit of moisture to grow it. So knowing what species you're putting in is really important. Sometimes people don't have that much acreage, so they will go buy bagged seed mixture, and I'm always a little bit leery of those because they bag them for all across Western Canada basically. So you get a lot of species that are not really suited to what you're trying to do or your conditions. They're kind of the shotgun approach because they want to be guaranteed that when they sell you a bag that says that it is a pasture blend or a hay blend, that something comes up. So you might be in a drier region and you want to be sure something comes up, or you might be in a wetter region and you want to be sure something comes up. But you often won't see a lot of the species if you're in a drier area, and vice versa, they'll just die out. So I think it's actually better to sit down and take a little bit of time and try to put together a forage blend that's suited and adapted to your area. One of the things that's happened a lot with the kind of moisture we've been having with the high rain and then the drought is salinity in a lot of soils. And just wanted to show you some salt tolerance. You can see right here that barley is about the most tolerant of the cereal crops. And so if you can't grow barley anymore, it's really time to switch that land over into a forage, or else you are just going to be weeds. Alfalfa has got pretty good salt tolerance. It's moderate. Then you pretty much go into the grasses, and something like tall wheatgrass, bearded wheatgrass, salt mealgrass, they're very high salt tolerance, but I would call them more conservation grasses. For the most part, you wouldn't want to grow those grasses for livestock production or hay production. Same with Altai wild rye, but certainly AC Saltlander, which is the new variety that's a cross between quackgrass and blue stem, I think, has also got really good salt tolerance. I'm only ever a little bit hesitant to recommend it because where the seed replication has taken place in Alberta is they have downy brome issues, and downy brome is a very bad annual weed or biennial weed. And if you don't like foxtail barley, you will not like downy brome on your land any better. So I've been a little bit hesitant to recommend it. Slender wheatgrass is a native grass that comes on like gangbusters, but it's short-lived. So that's the thing. In about 3 years, it's going to start to peter out. So you do have some ability, and there is a fact sheet that we do have on sort of selecting forages for salt tolerance and how to put them on the landscape to help deal with your salt soils on issues in your area. One of the last things I want to talk about is seeding depth. It's probably one of the most important things. Forage seeds are extremely small, and so they need to be placed quite shallow. And you can see here with something like Timothy, it's a very tiny seed. It's only 2 pounds per acre seeding rates, and that's got 1 billion seeds in it. So, you know, if you seed it at less than an inch, you get almost 90% germination, but as soon as it goes over an inch, this is 1 inch and 3/8, you've already dropped it down by half, more than half. And if you get into 2 inches, you get nothing. Intermediate wheatgrass, you can see, I don't know if this is a mistake here, but that's what their data showed them. But you can see every single one of these drop. So it's very important to know how deep you're seeding your forages. So lastly, on that note, I wanted to say I think the biggest mistakes that I see in seeding forages is trying to get a deal on the seed. If you go over those cost production sheets and you look at all of your costs, you'll find out that your seed cost is only about, I think they used to say 13%, but it looked to me more like it was about 18% of your cost right now. So that's only a portion of all of your costs, so to try to skimp there is maybe not the best place to skimp unless you can be kind of certain where you're getting your seed from and that it's good quality. When you buy good quality seed, I always ask for the certificate of analysis, and that tells you what variety it is, It tells you the germination on it. It tells you what kind of weed seeds are in there. So all those things are very important, particularly in something like this. If you didn't know that the germination on that Timothy was 95% when you seeded it and you got a poor catch, you don't know what to go back to look at. Was it the poor quality seed and you didn't increase your seeding rate, or did you seed too deep? Like, it gets very hard to distinguish where your mistake was made. Some seeds held over for years and years, and it may have only had a 40% germination rate to begin with, and that's why you're getting the seeds so cheap. And that's fine, you can use it, but if you only got 40% germination rate, you probably want to double your seeding rate on that. Seed into a firm, moist seed bed. It's actually quite amazing how firm a seed bed for forages can be. It needs to be so that when you step on it, you don't sink into the soil much more than about 1/4 of an inch. Seed early in the spring, and that goes with the fertilizers too. One of the mistakes that I see with fertilizers is people get it custom applicated, and they don't order it soon enough, and so the custom applicators get busy doing the annual crops. And if the guy shows up to your place in the middle of June to fertilize your forages, you're probably too late, because most of our growth happens in late May through June and probably the first week or 2 of July. And then we run out of moisture. So if you don't get that fertilizer on really early in the spring, or the seeds in the spring, then you run out of moisture, and you won't get a good stand. Controlling weeds. A lot of the seedlings, I guess one of the things is guys are not very used to seeding forages. You don't usually do it that many times in your lifetime. On a piece of land. These are perennial forages, so they're not as interested in making top growth as they are about making a root system, because that's how they perennialize themselves, is making a perennial root system. So they're pretty small seeds, so they're wimpy, and if you have bad weed control or too heavy of a cover crop, those sort of things, it really hinders that crop establishment. This plant that I'm showing you here is tall fescue with alfalfa, and that was seeded in the spring, and we pulled it out in the probably about August, and you can see it's almost 2 feet tall, and that was seeded without a cover crop early in the spring with some fertility. I've already talked about seeding hardy adapted varieties. So with that, do you have any questions?
Yes, Jane, I have a couple of questions here. The first one is, what is your opinion for seeding directly into an existing forage stand to increase production?
The question is a good one, and we get it a lot. It kind of depends. If the stand is really poor and in really bad shape, and you seed in early with alfalfa, you may get some catch, but it is very iffy. You cannot really seed grasses into an existing grass stand. I would say that's as good as throwing your money away. So unless you're willing to spray that stand out and start over again, you can sometimes get alfalfa into a grass stand, but you'll never get grass into grass, and you won't get grass into alfalfa. And I guess a good way of thinking about it is a seedling may germinate, and you get that seed on early in the spring into that existing stand, but you have to remember that those mature, full-grown forages have got an extensive root system. And so the seedling may germinate and have a couple inches of root, where the other one might have a half a mile of roots. And it's kind of the same as putting a full-grown man and a newborn baby into a room and only enough food for one, and the man has no conscience. Who's going to get the food? Well, the man is. And plants have no conscience. They just compete for the nutrients, space, moisture, everything. And so you're basically putting a newborn baby into a room with full-grown adults, and they don't usually survive. So if you have a lot of bare ground, you could maybe scratch some in. It might work, but if you kind of just have a stand that's been maybe overgrazed and it's really thinned out, and then you got some drought and it's doing poorly, you're probably better to start over again. And I would really suggest looking at your management, because the idea of forage stands wearing out is not, I don't really think of it that way. I think that they've just been worn out through poor use or bad management. So it's important to also look at your management. Second question?
Okay, is there a point where I should look at not haying a crop and grazing it instead?
I'm not sure I really understand what point you're getting at, whether or not you feel there's not enough yield there. And I guess that's up to you. I would suggest that if there's not a very good stand there and you're not going to get at least a bale per acre, like maybe a 1,300 or 1,400 pound bale per acre, then I would probably graze, because I think that the machinery costs, the wear and tear on the machinery, fuel, and everything else to hay crop with less yield than that probably is not economical to do, so I would probably switch to grazing.
Okay, thank you. I have another one here. I only have a limited amount of cash, say like $25 an acre. Which fertilizer would I get my best return on investment? And it is in an alfalfa grass stand.
An alfalfa grass stand. Well, I would certainly probably do a soil test, because you have limited amount of money, and I would look at PK and S and see which one is your most limiting on those by the recommendations, and I would spend my money on that part of the fertilizer program.
Thanks, Jen. And Glenn Friesen is also on the webinar and agrees that you should do a soil test first. So that's all the questions that I have right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll turn you over to Lionel.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I guess with that, you know, good presentation regarding regarding the forages and how we can you know, increase what forages we do have out there. Next we have Joahn Gavloski on the webinar, and John's going to talk about some of the insect issues that we could see this coming year in our forages, and I guess we wanted him to make sure he talked about the alfalfa weevil. So I think John is on, so we'll let John take over.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. Yeah, my presentation is going to focus mainly on alfalfa weevil, but I will cover a couple other insects as well. Just gonna. You can see my screen, okay? Can you, Lionel?
Yes, we can see your screen fine, John.
Okay. I'm just working on getting things to advance here. 1 second.
Oh, sorry, bottom.
Okay, so just to summarize what I'll be talking about, I'm going to go over the life cycle of the alfalfa weevil, how to monitor for it. There's a couple different techniques that can be used, and we'll go over what is best, economic thresholds, and the ways that it can be managed. I'll also go over the grasshopper forecast and cover a few insects that when you're out sampling alfalfa, you're likely to see. Oops, wrong way. Here we go. Okay, so just an introduction to the alfalfa weevil. In Manitoba, most of the damage we get from alfalfa weevil is in anywhere from about late May till early July. So they're an early season insect. So for people growing alfalfa, the time to start looking for them would be in May. Even early May would be good to start. Again, they come out quite early, and it's mainly a first cut or potentially very early second cut problem here in Manitoba. Now, I mention that because if you are reading up on this insect, you will see some reports and fact sheets where it refers to it as a second cut issue more than a first cut issue. Those are from the U.S., and depending on where this insect is, the timing will be different. So to go over what you're looking for alfalfa weevil, the weevil itself, it's a brown beetle, so you can see it on the screen here, a light brown beetle, and they tend to have a darker brown stripe that goes down their back, and that's one way you can tell them from other beetles or weevils that will be on alfalfa. There's a couple other insects that look similar. sweet clover weevil, and there's a couple other weevils that will be in alfalfa, but none of them have that dark brown stripe down the back. So if you see that dark brown stripe, it's alfalfa weevil. Now the weevil will get darker as they get older, so sometimes that stripe becomes harder to see. And another thing you'll notice is on the front of the weevil, if you look hard, there is what looks like a snout. This group of beetles is called snout beetles because they all do have that snout. That snout isn't used to puncture tissue. There's mouth parts at the tip of that snout, which is what they feed with. So they're chewers. They chew their food. Now the adult weevil I just showed you, although it feeds on alfalfa, it does very little damage as an adult. It's the larvae that do the vast majority of damage. So this is really what you got to key in on when you're doing your scouting. The larvae, at least initially, when they're young, they'll be kind of a very light green, almost yellow color. And you may not see much in the way of striping when they're young. You'll notice they've got a dark head on them. But as they get bigger, they turn more of a very definite green color. The one in the middle here is a fully grown alfalfa weevil larva. So definitely green, and you will see a white stripe going down the back of the fully grown larva. Again, younger larvae, that stripe is harder to pick out. One thing you'll note too, if you're sampling them, if you tap them into a bucket or container, they do like to curl up quite a bit. And if you have a close look, you'll notice there's no really recognizable legs on these either. They're legless larvae. They really can't move much. So not very mobile. And when they get fully grown, this one in the middle here would be about maybe 8 to 10 millimeters long when it's fully grown. So they're not big caterpillars. If you see, there's about 3 or 4 other green caterpillars that can be on alfalfa. Technically, this is not a caterpillar because it's a beetle larva, but you've got the alfalfa looper, the green cloverworm potentially, the alfalfa butterfly larva. There's a few other green caterpillar-like things on alfalfa. They will all have very distinctive legs and be able to crawl quite well. Whereas alfalfa weevil, as mentioned, no legs and not very mobile. So they're easy enough to tell from the other green things on alfalfa. And this is another stage here, and this is important to note. These little kind of silky, lacy balls in my picture, I've got 2 of them I'm showing. These are the pupa of alfalfa weevil. And you'll notice inside that silky case is what was the green larva. When they're ready to pupate, they form this silky case, and they become quite immobile, and they're transforming into the adult in this stage. The reason I mention that it's good to know what these look like, when you're sampling for the larva, if you start seeing a lot of these silky cases on the plants, that means they're starting to pupate. And if you're starting to see quite a few of these, the part of their life cycle where they're capable of doing a lot of damage is coming to an end. They have 1 generation per year, so they go through that larva stage once, they go through the pupa stage once, and once that's done, you won't see much damage the rest of the year. Because as mentioned, the adults don't do much damage. So take note of the larva and the pupa. And if you start to see pupa, damage is almost done. As a bit of a side note here, alfalfa weevil was actually introduced into North America about 3 separate times. And I've listed all 3 here. Once in the western part of the U.S., once in the south, and once in the east. And what's interesting, at least from an entomological perspective, what's interesting is these 3 introductions, although they're the same species, they were different strains of the same species. So to look at them, they would look the same, but in their life cycle and behavior, they are slightly different. So this can be confusing at times. If you're reading up on this insect, sometimes you'll see the term Egyptian alfalfa weevil mentioned. We don't have that one here. That's more southern, mainly southwest U.S. We probably have both the western and the eastern alfalfa weevil here. So again, if you're reading up on this and you start seeing terms like western alfalfa weevil, eastern alfalfa weevil, it's just different strains of the same insect, and we probably have both the eastern and the western present in Manitoba. So hopefully that's not too confusing. I've gone over a little bit of the life cycle already, but I'll just kind of rehash it a bit. The adults are what overwinters. So right now, a lot of those will be in bushy areas, shelter belts, areas with trees, areas with a lot of debris outside the field, potentially some in the field, but probably most outside your field. That's what overwinters, the adult weevil. They come out early in the season as an adult, mate, and the females will move into the alfalfa. Alfalfa is their preferred host plant. They'll move into clover as well. But really, alfalfa and to some degree clover, those are their two preferred legumes. The females will chew tiny little holes in the stems, and each hole is big enough so that they can lay about 10 eggs in there. So if you're out looking at your alfalfa stand in, say, May, and you start noticing a lot of little holes in the stems, have a close look and see if you can see clusters of eggs in there. And if you can, it's a decent chance that is alfalfa weevil eggs. Once the eggs hatch, the larvae go through 4 very distinct stages. And I showed you earlier, they will grow and even change in color as they go through each of those stages. And then they spin that fibrous cocoon to become the pupa. And then again, they're done their damaging stage for the year. You won't get much more damage after that. The adult weevils will start coming out again in July. You'll see them again. They don't like hot temperatures, so in most years what will happen is the adults will come out again for a second time in July. Then they do something called estivation. Down here on the screen, big word, basically it means they rest. To escape the hot summer weather, they go into a resting stage, and they're basically inactive through much of late July and August, and then they'll come back out again into the alfalfa fields, feed a little bit more, but don't do a lot of damage at that point, and then go into their overwintering. So that's the full life cycle of the weevil. And as mentioned, for our purposes here in Manitoba, and for most of the Canadian prairies, it's a first cut problem, and maybe keep an eye on that the second cut initial growth. Some of the larvae do persist into July. Usually around mid-July, the larvae start to get pretty scarce. They're all turning to pupa by then. So again, mainly first cut or early second cut issue. So the economics of the feeding. It really varies with how tall and robust your alfalfa stand is when the larvae start to peak in their populations. So as a general guideline, if your alfalfa is about 12 inches or 30 centimeters high, each larva per stem will cost you a loss of about 0.4 tons of dry hay per acre. Taller alfalfa, 16 inches or 40 centimeters, a larva per stem will lead to a loss of about 0.1 tons per acre. So the bigger the alfalfa is, the less damage per larva per stem. So to develop economic thresholds or guidelines, in addition to measuring how many larvae you have per stem, it's also good to at least have a rough idea of the height of your alfalfa stand. So here's some of the economic thresholds that have been suggested. Now again, if you're reading up on this, if you were to Google alfalfa weevil, you will see different economic thresholds or action thresholds depending on what site you get to. There's been different things suggested over the years. Just to go to the far extreme, a study done back in the 70s was suggesting a threshold of 56 larvae per stem, which is incredibly high, and I don't know if that's quite accurate. But again, that's one of the suggested thresholds. The ones that get used the most are these here. And again, they're based on the height of your alfalfa stand. a stand less than about a foot tall, one larva per stem is probably a realistic threshold. Between 12 and 16 inches or 30 to 40 centimeters, about 2 larvae per stem. And if your stand is greater than 40 centimeters, about 3 larvae per stem. Those would be realistic economic thresholds. Now on the second growth, on the regrowth, keep an eye on that as well. And a suggested economic threshold here would be about 2 or more active larvae per crown, or 4 to 8 larvae per square foot. Now the tricky thing is to get those counts. What is the best technique to use? And again, this is sort of a debatable thing. A lot of studies have been done. But what I'm going to go over is something called basically the stem bucket technique. And we'll have a look at that in detail. There's been studies that have compared sweep net sampling to this shake bucket technique that I'll go over. Generally speaking, the sweep net sampling technique is more variable than the shake bucket technique. So you can use a sweep net to get some idea of numbers. But again, the problem with the sweep net technique is if you get 2 or 3 people doing the same set of sweeps, because of the differences in the way they sweep, often you get very different numbers. Whereas with this shake bucket technique I'll go over, the results are usually more uniform when you get different people doing it. And that's why a lot of people think it is probably a better technique to be using. So for the shake bucket technique, it's pretty simple. Really what you do is you go and you clip about 10 stems in a location. You place them into a bucket and you shake them vigorously in the bucket to get the larva off, and then you count the larva. And in addition, take at least a few of the stems and have a close look. See if you potentially missed any larvae and add those to your count. So you're clipping stems, shake them over a bucket, and counting larvae. And do that in a few areas of the field. Now, the way you remove the stems is important. One of the studies that was done on this technique, they had people basically ripping the stems out by hand, basically just taking the stem and snapping their wrist and trying to break them off. And then they had other people using pruning shears, other people using knives, and they found that just trying to break the stems by hand and do the counts, you lose a lot of larvae because you end up shaking or moving the plant a lot in the field as you're breaking it. So by the time you get it to the bucket to do your counts, you've already lost a few larvae. Whatever technique you can use that's going to disturb the plant the least as you're removing it and getting into the bucket, the more accurate your counts are going to be. So my suggestion would be use something like pruning shears or a sharp knife, and make sure that there's very little movement of the stem as you're breaking it and getting it transferred to that bucket. And then you'll have fairly accurate counts. Now when you're doing the sampling, also take note of how many pupa cases are you seeing. And this is why, in addition to just shaking the stems and counting larvae, good to have a look at the plants. Sometimes you'll see those pupa cases right on the plant. And if you're starting to see a lot of pupa cases, take note, if it looks like a quarter or a half of your population seems to be as pupa, not larvae anymore, you probably don't need to be worried too much about controlling them because your population is now at a stage where they're going into their non-damaging stages. The other thing to take note of is what the larvae look like. Are they that more vibrant green with the white stripe that I showed you in the picture, or are they looking pretty pale or brown? Brown larvae might mean they're diseased. So just something else to take note of. Are there signs of disease larvae or signs that there's been a lot of predation happening? So just other things to take note of to help you with your decision making. Okay, moving on to control. What do you do if you find that you are above the economic threshold? And once again, what you do may depend partially at least on the stage of your alfalfa at the time. It's been suggested that if the alfalfa is 40 centimeters or taller, so that's 16 inches or higher, that early cutting is the preferred method of controlling the weevil. Recall that the weevil doesn't have legs. They're not very mobile. So if you cut the alfalfa and it dries out fairly quickly, they will essentially all starve to death. Now, exceptions can happen if we get cool, damp conditions after cutting and it's taking long for the alfalfa to dry. You may find that a lot of larvae are still surviving and make it onto that the regrowth that's coming up. If you get good, hot, dry weather right after a cut, a lot of times you get very high levels of kill of the alfalfa weevil. So early cutting can be a very successful control method. But again, if you are doing that, even if it has been hot, dry weather, I would suggest keep an eye on the regrowth. Go check it a few days after the cut and just see potentially what that weevil population is like on that regrowth. Another management option is grazing. It might not be a practical thing in a lot of cases, but there have been studies, at least in the U.S., where they've had livestock out eating alfalfa that was very heavily infested with alfalfa weevil and found that they could get up to about 90% control. So now again, that would be very intensive grazing in that case. Alfalfa that has alfalfa weevil is perfectly safe to eat. There's no safety issues or toxic side effects to have to worry about. So grazing is an option if that's practical. And biocontrol, I should mention this one because in most of North America, there's been releases of different parasitic wasps, and they've been very highly successful in many areas. Eastern North America, there's been releases of one of the wasps here I'm mentioning, Bathyplexus curculianus. That species and another similar one, Bathyplexus erroneus, in Eastern North America, they have done an incredibly good job at reducing the alfalfa weevil population to essentially non-economical populations. And when the alfalfa weevil does move into new locations, the parasites do tend to follow it. And over time, once those populations of parasites get established, they do an excellent job keeping it below economic levels. So I guess the big question that we have to sort out here in Manitoba is, what are our parasite levels like? Are these species currently present? If not, can we bring them in? And will they be a long-term management strategy here? So those are things we really have to assess right now. I can't tell you one way or another what our populations of Bathyplexus are like, but that's one of the things I'm going to be looking into. Do we have those parasites already? And if not, are there ways we can get those released? Because as mentioned, when they are present, they can certainly keep a population below economic levels, at least in many years. Areas where they're quite abundant, people don't spray that often for alfalfa weevil. Insecticides, of course, are another option. I know for people growing hay, they're not used to applying a lot of insecticide. The seed growers, it's a different story. I've listed some of the options here. Just to go over a few, one thing you need to pay attention to, of course, is pre-harvest interval. If you're going to be cutting the hay relatively soon after you spray, make sure you choose something with an appropriate pre-harvest interval. Comments on a few of these products. Coragen's a newer product. I'm not sure price-wise how that compares to a lot of these other ones. A few of the, I guess, benefits of this product, it is relatively harmless to pollinators and bees, which in alfalfa can be good, especially if you're spraying during flowering time. So fairly safe product, fairly harmless to pollinators and quite a few predators. Matador silencer, these are products we call pyrethroids. They're very low rates of application, relatively cheap. They're temperature sensitive, so you don't want to be spraying them at high temperatures. and DSIS is registered for seed crops only. It would probably have too high of a pre-harvest interval for forage crops. Malathion, Imidan, Saigon, Lagon, if you're using these, be careful if you have a lot of pollinators in the field. They are less discriminating than some of the other products that I've mentioned there. So I'm going to change gears and move into our grasshopper forecast. And if you've got any questions on the weevil, please send them in, and I'll make sure I get to them when I'm done the presentation. So for our grasshopper populations, what we do annually is we conduct a survey in August. People do counts along roadsides and ditches, and we try to forecast what we expect to happen the next growing season. Now, the way this all relates, in August and September, the grasshopper population is out laying eggs. What we really need to know is how many eggs are likely to be in the soil going into the winter. Egg sampling is hard to do, so what we do, just to make the methodology simple, is count adult grasshoppers that are out laying the eggs, and we can compare our counts with previous years and see whether our population is going up or down. And we can also factor in weather data to help us determine, have they had good egg-laying conditions or not. So what the map here shows, any green on this map is showing essentially very low grasshopper counts in August. The yellow, especially the darker shades of yellow, are getting more into that moderate range of counts, and we really didn't have anything in our red or severe range for this past season. So most of our counts were light to moderate. This map a year ago would have had a lot more green on it. It would have had less of these yellow patches. So our counts are going up a little bit. They're certainly not in a level where we would be saying we're at a high risk of an outbreak. If we were seeing a lot of red on the map, that's when we really have to take caution. So again, a bit of yellow showing up. Populations are rising, but slowly, which leads me to conclude we probably won't have a widespread grasshopper outbreak next year. There might be localized areas that have some higher populations if things continue to increase. So certainly keep an eye for grasshoppers, but it's not as bad as some of the cycles in the past where they've been at outbreak levels. They did have very good egg-laying conditions in August and September. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The grasshoppers that were present would have had good conditions to lay their maximum number of eggs. So if by chance we get good conditions for survival in the early to mid-summer, that could lead to the grasshoppers becoming even more of an issue. What grasshoppers don't like is heavy rains in early June. Grasshopper eggs can survive flooding even for a week or two, but once the eggs hatch, those young grasshoppers do not do well if it's very wet, damp conditions, or particularly if there's any kind of flooding. They do not do well at all. So very heavy rains in early June when the eggs are hatching is hard on grasshopper populations. So if we have a dry summer next year, particularly dry earlier on when the grasshoppers are getting going, that could help the population stay high and build. If we get a lot of rain early in the season, that can take the population down a little bit. So just a few other things to watch when you're scouting your alfalfa. I'm throwing this slide here of alfalfa blotch leaf miner in just because we are seeing enough of this in Manitoba that it gets people's curiosity, and I always get a few calls on this every year. If you start seeing these little almost question mark like patterns on your leaves, and in this picture here, there's actually a fly maggot inside the little question mark right where the arrow is. This is called alfalfa blotch leaf miner. The adult is a fly that will kind of make what looks like pinholes in the leaves where they lay their eggs. And when the eggs hatch, you get these larvae that make these question mark shaped mines. This insect has been here for a while. It's introduced. It's not native. but it also is controlled very heavily by parasites. And we went through a period back in the early 2000s where the population was building, and in the last few years, the population seems to have declined. What I'm thinking has happened and hoping has happened is that the parasite population has caught up to it and has them contained to where we hope they stay. But if you are doing scouting and you see these question mark type mines in the leaves, that's alfalfa blotchleaf miner. And I want to show a few beneficial insects as well, because although some of these are common, other ones people don't really associate with being beneficials, and often I get calls on them. What are they? The little black alligator-like insect on the upper left-hand part of the screen, this is a lady beetle, or ladybug, as a lot of people call them. This is the larva stage. And they're predators. They eat mainly aphids, and in alfalfa, they'll be feeding on aphids, potentially very young alfalfa weevil larvae they would feed on, and eggs of other insects. The middle picture is the pupa of the lady beetle, and of course, the adult stage on the bottom here. And again, very good predators. Just a quick note here. A lot of our species of lady beetles, if we count how many aphids per day they eat, for many species, it's somewhere around 100 aphids per day per lady beetle. And that goes for both the adult and some of the later juvenile stages. So they have big appetites, and they're what's helping to keep your aphid populations low. And like I said, to some degree, they could help out feeding on some of the slower moving insects such as alfalfa weevil that are on the crop. Another one that you'll see a lot of in alfalfa is lacewings, mainly the green lacewing shown in the upper left-hand photo here. They, again, eat aphids and slow-moving things. And on the right-hand side of the screen, this is the larva of a green lacewing. They will feed on things like aphids, potentially alfalfa weevil as well. They're quite broad in their host range, and I've even seen them run down and catch lygus bugs. Not too many things will catch lygus bugs because they're pretty quick, but I have seen lacewing larvae do that, so they can be very beneficial predators. Hoverflies, a lot of these look like miniature bees, and you'll see them flying around your alfalfa. One thing you'll note before they land on a flower, they tend to hover like a helicopter before they land. Bees can't do that. They have to land immediately. They can't hover. So there's often a lot of hoverflies in the alfalfa field. Essentially, they're pollinators as adults, but their larva stage is almost slug-like, and they're very good predators, mainly of slow-moving things like aphids. But one of the things I wanted to point out, some species do have a green legless larva, and these could easily be confused with alfalfa weevil. So not to confuse you, but if you are seeing something that is green, but even more slug-like than an alfalfa weevil, and it doesn't have that white stripe or the black head, it's quite possibly a hoverfly larva, and that's a good predator. As mentioned, one of the big differences between these, you'll notice there is no black head on the hoverfly larva, and you won't see the distinctive white stripe. So that's how you can tell them apart. And this will be a little bit smaller, but again, very much slug-like. And when you watch them on the alfalfa, they tend to be probing with their front end quite a bit. Trying to get the pointer. The tapered end up here is the mouth end of the hoverfly larva. They tend to be probing around a lot for aphids and things with that. And when they catch one, they tend to pick it up, hold it in the air, and suck the juice out. Then they'll put it down and be probing again. So behaviorally, they're a little bit different than the weevil as well. But they're probably one of the things that you're most likely to confuse with alfalfa weevil because they are legless and green. Pirate bugs, this photo is on sunflowers, but you see a lot of them in alfalfa as well. Small insects, just a couple millimeters, black and white, very quick, always running around. They like insect eggs, so if they were to come across a mass of eggs, they would devour it. Very good egg predators. And one more predator to show, damsel bugs, again, very common in alfalfa. They're, well, primarily brown insects, very quick, big beak on them. And what they do is when they catch an insect, again, they're quick, they'll run down something like an alfalfa weevil. When they catch it, what they do is they insert their beak and they inject a venom, which essentially paralyzes the larva, and then they suck the juice out of it. And being a quicker insect, they will feed on caterpillars, alfalfa weevil larvae, things like that, not just aphids like some of the other predators. So one thing I just want to note just in finishing here is if you are spraying for alfalfa weevil, again, consider the timing and whether or not the alfalfa is flowering. If it's a flowering crop, there's going to be honeybees in there. And you want to do whatever you can to minimize the damage to the bees and the bee colonies. So if you do have to be spraying, evening time is highly preferred. The alfalfa weevil larvae aren't going to be moving around a lot between day and night, so you are okay spraying late in the day or early morning for alfalfa weevil. And if there's going to be bees foraging, that's highly advised to be doing spraying either later or very early in the morning. Late day is the best. If you can be spraying after about 8 p.m., that's highly preferred if that's practical and possible. And also some of the products, such as the pyrethroids, will work better at those lower temperatures. If you have a beekeeper nearby, make sure you warn them. And if you're concerned because you've got a flowering crop, you can choose a less toxic pesticide to the bees. We do have a table in our Guide to Crop Protection that ranks the products for their toxicity to bees. So if you're trying to pick out a product that's less harmful to the bees, you could consult that table and it will help you make a good choice. The other thing you might want to consider doing if you are spraying for alfalfa weevil is to leave a check strip. The reason I recommend this is it's good to have some idea, what did your spraying accomplish? It doesn't have to be a big area, but to leave a little bit of a check strip, if it's practical, you'll be able to see what happens in that strip and get some idea how valuable was that spraying. Has it saved me yield? Has it made me money doing that or not? I advise that for many of our defoliating pests, just to get an idea on how productive that spray actually was. So maybe I'll end with that, and if you have any questions, I'm certainly open to receiving them.
Okay, John, I do have a question here, and they want to know, would spraying the headlines and around sloughs of the field be wise if they had a problem with insects last year?
For alfalfa weevil, they're not known to have an edge effect like some insects could. So I guess the short answer is no. I would say scout your field, and if you do end up in a spray situation, odds are you'll be spraying the whole field. You can certainly sample different areas of the field and see if there does appear to be an edge effect and spray accordingly. But with alfalfa weevil, it's not known to exhibit those edge effects, so it's not something that's typically done. And as far as spraying the edges to try to control overwintering populations or as they're moving in, again, I'm not sure that you're going to be too effective in doing that. You probably won't get good kill trying to kill an overwintering population, and they're good enough at moving into a field that I'm not sure you'd have much success doing that.
Okay, thanks, John. That's the only questions I have. Lionel, is there anything that you want to go on from here?
Well, no, I think that's everything that we have for right now. Thanks, John. That was a good presentation, and kind of got us up to speed on the weevils. Just so we know, we've been having quite a bit of problems with it especially in the Southwest over the last couple of years here. So kind of give us a little bit of heads up as to what we could be looking for. So thanks again, John.
Okay, thank you.
Linda, if you want to give me the screen back. I guess with that, this webinar was kind of put together between the Southwest and South Parkland. We had a get-together, and so I figured I'd put the names of the FDAs in the of Southwest and South Parkland. So if you're wanting more information on anything that was discussed today, that's there. Also, if you want to get a hold of John, we can get you his number. I've got Jane's number in there. Again, if you have any questions regarding anything that was discussed today, feel free to give any of these people a call or just contact your local grow office. These are recorded, so if you'd like to pass it on to somebody or let somebody else know about it, you can also let us know and we can get you the link for it. So I guess with that, Linda, I think we've covered all the questions. So I think the goal was to be done close to 2:30, so we're not too far off. So thanks again to the presenters, and that's it for today.
Just one thing, Lionel, I think Andrea's cell phone number is wrong. Andrea's cell should be 851-6087. So that's Andrea's 851-6087. So thanks.